Hi, Mike Kennedy. We're going to start with a little story here. I made this up to show the principle, but okay. So I buy this really expensive piece of wood, you know, and I make a sign out of it. And, I sell it to a business, right? And the business, it's there. And the business gets sold. And the guy takes the sign and says, well, I can't use this, but this is obviously really, really nice, classy piece of wood and the shape of it and everything. I'll just sand it down and then I'll paint over it. So sands the lettering, that I puts it on, fine. And then, 5 years more pass. He goes out of business. Well, it's sitting there. The sign ends up in some flea market, and someone sees it and says, I remember this sign, but the writing on it, it isn't what I remember. So he buys it, takes it home, and photographs it under ultraviolet light. And what he's able to detect with that is, from my original painting, there's still particles of paint that went deeper into the wood. So by photographing this thing with ultraviolet light, he can read the previous sign. The marks are still there. They're just not visible to the eye, but there are these things that can be detected, and he very easily can read what the sign said before it was sanded down and repainted. Well, this happens with writing material in the ancient world, with parchment and things. It was things to write on were extremely expensive, or labor intensive, or however you want to say that, used a lot of resources. So if you had something written down and you no longer needed that, or you didn't think what was on it was important now, maybe you even got the paper from somewhere else, the parchment, you could scrape the text off, just like that analogy with the sign. You could scrape that off and then write your thing over it. Well, this is exactly what happens sometimes. There was a really big find by an Australian scientist, researcher, that photographed this document. And I'm sure there's a lot more than just photographing it under ultraviolet light. There's probably some type of things they go through, spectral analysis, whatever. But he was able to pull out on this piece of parchment that there was actually from 1500 years ago, or did they say 200, 300 AD, somewhere around there, there's actually underneath not one layer of text, but a third layer. So this has been used 3 times, but the bottom layer is in fact part of the Gospel of Mathew, and it's in Syriac writing. When I say that, I mean their language and things. So that's a language that is kind of similar to Aramaic. So it would be very similar to what Jesus would have used, perhaps. And there was a very large contingent of Christians that would have probably used the Syriac language too. And so, it's great. All of a sudden we have this, another copy to add. I guess there's only been a few, so this is like a really, really big find. That this is the third thing they found in this Syriac script, this, language and form of writing from then. I mean, we get all kinds of other things in Latin and Greek and different things, but this is considered a big find. So you look at that and say, wow, that's really neat. And then we'll look at it somewhere else. We're going to go over to Dan Brubaker, Dr. Daniel Brubaker, and the Quran, okay? What he did was, there's a huge, what do I want to say, information explosion, in a way, about the Quran, the text that Muslims use, and the history of it. Basically, what we have found now is that these documents, there's copies or fragments of copies, whatever, there's all kinds of material in museums, and they can be accessed by researchers. So this Daniel Brubaker goes in, he's writing his doctorate thesis on the variant Quran. In other words, what he's found that, unlike the current claim that Muslims have, that the words of Allah cannot be corrupted, the idea that the Quran was always exactly the same as it is now, not even a letter or a dot is out of place, or they recite it too, and they'll say the sound is exactly the same. But they give in with the idea that, well, there are different dialects, so someone from here reciting it might be different from someone over here reciting it. But what Daniel Brubaker found was these types of scrapings, like we were talking before, but they were just in certain places. And what is odd about it is that most of the text is clearly a more ancient form of Arabic, and these corrections were put in much later. How can we tell that? They're in a newer form of Arabic. The original form of Arabic during the time when these were written, which you can see in the other parts of the document. I mean, these are used, you can see above and below it. It's just usually a word or two. But someone scraped that off the text and written something else in. And not thinking, at least, my thought would be, is they didn't think to make it match the other text as far as the style of text or the age of the text. It would kind of be like me, say I've got, and I guess there are no original copies of Shakespeare. I looked that up, for example, and there's no good example, but let's pretend we have an original copy, and I go back, and some of the things aren't the way they are today. In the copies of copies, we have a Shakespeare's Hamlet, say. So I go back with my original document, I scrape those off, and I write in the word or name or number that I want. Well, I don't know Old English, so, and I'm going to write completely different than that person. So it's going to be extremely obvious that someone later, much later, in this case, went and corrected that original to match what their perception of Shakespeare should have been. And this is what's happened with the Quran. Now, what's would be really interesting now after reading this, I don't know, maybe Dan Brubaker isn't set up for this or whatever. It'd be really interesting to take, now he was allowed to photograph all kinds of documents, but it was just regular photographs. It'd be very interesting if he somehow could go back to one of those pages he found with some of the corrections on them, photograph them with ultraviolet light, and see what's actually there. In other words, where this has just been written over, appears to be written over only once, that the original words that are underneath, or numbers, letters, or whatever, could be read. And it would just be very interesting to see what type of corrections are being made to a document that can't be changed or altered and is absolutely, positively, exactly the same as when, Muhammad got it from the angel Gabriel, who got it from God. God speaks in Arabic, and, blah, 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 go, the whole system. But if someone has to go back and correct it, there's something wrong. Because you can't, in the understanding of Muslims, you can't even copy it wrong. In other words, I decided that I wanted to publish a version of the Quran and change some of the things to suit me. It would be impossible to do because Allah's word can't be altered. So Anyways, interesting dilemma. In one case, we're looking at this thing where we find, uh, you know, a very rare example of this particular Syriac type language, uh, that presents uh, parts of the Gospel of Mathew. I think it was around chapter 12, 11 or 12, somewhere around there. But so you look at that and you say, wow, this is great. We have some other piece of information now. And Christian scholars, Bible scholars, don't worry about the idea that everything isn't exactly the same. We understand there's going to be variations. And but with this idea with the Quran and these scrapings, the corrections, especially when they're done in much later Arabic. See, really, the time that supposedly these are being written. Now, Muhammad couldn't read or write, but he supposedly got these, people memorized them, and then these all got written down. And it's just interesting that form of Arabic at that time is quite a bit different than it's going to be even 200 years later, because they have there's lots of dots and marks with the letters. Like, you would think like the letter I has a dot, okay, lowercase I. Now, if you were to write that and not put the I on top of it, someone could, I suppose, mistake that for a lowercase l, or is it the number 1? There could be some confusion. But usually from the context, you would know what it was. In other words, if there's a word fix and there's an I there, lowercase, and it doesn't have the dot, you probably know it is an FLX. It's fix. Well, the Quran is kind of like that, but it's much more extreme. So the early versions of Arabic didn't have all these markings with it to differentiate necessarily exactly what letters meant, because they were understood in context for the people back then when they read it. They would, just like you could use an example too. The Hebrew people would not say the name of God, and they wouldn't even write it. So they left some of the vowels. They left the vowels out. Now, any Jewish person looking at that knows exactly what that means, even though these vowels are missing. And so a lot of the Quran is like that in the earlier languages. And the thing is, though, a sentence that has a lot of these in it can be translated and understood in various ways. In other words, you might say, and there will be examples that, some of the other researchers and things will give, but the idea that you might say, Muhammad went to the mountain. Okay, you read that. And someone else read it and says, no, this says Muhammad, the mountain came to Muhammad. And you couldn't necessarily just look at that text on itself and say, oh, no, this is what it says. Oh, and no, this is what it says. And so, as Arabic became more refined, these dots and everything were put in these editions so that there wouldn't be this big question about whether this sentence says Muhammad came to the mountain or the sentence says the mountain came to Muhammad. Because the letters in there could be construed to be different letters, and reading it one way, even though it's really kind of opposite of what the other way, are both valid readings, because you don't have the context. Now, maybe within the context of the thing, you might be able to see that, but a lot of times it's just very questionable. And what made me think of all this was I watched this video the other day, and these an imam, I believe, like, Catholics have a priest, Protestants have a pastor, Jews have a rabbi, and Muslims have an imam. I believe that's how you say it. But I'm watching this video, and they're breaking down, crying, and they're so upset because basically, people, young people are leaving Islam in record numbers, and people aren't respecting the Quran. That was the thing this guy was saying, and they were just really, really upset. And it's hard when now that we have this huge body of information that anyone can access, some of the claims that have been made about the Quran, students, young people that are searching and looking for something, in their search and study of the Quran, they end up leaving Islam. And that in fact, was the number one cause why 25% of young Muslims were leaving the faith, because the Quran is such a stumbling block. There's so many different things in it, and there's it says things that are not true in the context of history, says things about Jews that are not right, things that are about Christians that are not right, and I'm talking about facts and things. So it's like, if Allah wrote the Quran, there wouldn't be these glaring errors in it about one part of the Quran says that they believe Ezra, Jews believe Ezra was the son of God, and it's like, in a divine way, and it's like, no, they don't. And mistakes about what Christians believe as far as the Trinity are in there too. And again, those could be mistakes that a human would make, but they wouldn't be a mistake that God would make. But anyway, there we go. Scraping on text and what is underneath. Bye.